Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my video review of the Viltrox AF 35mm F1.7. Now, previously, we really didn't have a name for this series of lightweight lenses that Viltrox has been making both for APS-C and for full-frame cameras. But now we do. They are naming this the Air series. And a lot like the Samyang Tiny series, there is a lot of kind of shared strengths there in that they are small and lightweight, but they have a surprisingly robust overall optical performance. The advantage for the Air series, I would say, is that they tend to retail at about half the price of what Samyang's Tiny series has. And so here at right under $180, this I think is going to be another hit for them. Now, this is the second of the APS-C lenses in this series. The first of those was a 56mm f1.7, and I think that lens, at least from the response I've had from you all, has been a hit. I've tested it now both on Fuji X mount, which I'm reviewing the 35mm on today, but then also I've tested it on Sony E mount, and this lens will also be coming for Fuji, Sony E mount, and then for Nikon Z mount, but all for their APS-C platforms. So at a 35mm lens on APS-C, crop factor of 1.5 times on all of these platforms, comes out to about 52.5 millimeters on APS-C, making it essentially a Nifty 50. And at a price point of under $180, this is clearly a great value. But is it worth buying for you? Well, that's what we're here to explore today, right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is sponsored by the Fantom Tracker. Are you someone prone to misplacing your wallet or bag? If so, the Fantom Tracker card is definitely for you. This credit card sized tracker fits perfectly in any wallet or bag and functions like an Apple AirTag. It can be locally tracked via a 95 decibel beeping noise that can be heard up to 300 feet away, but also on a global level via Apple's Find My network and its map. Unlike many other trackers, the Fantom Tracker card has a built-in rechargeable battery that can be easily charged via any wireless charger, and a single charge will last up to 6 months. The low price of the Fantom Tracker makes it a perfect gift, and you can save even more by visiting store.fantomwallet.com and using code Dustin20 at checkout. That's store.fantomwallet.com and use code Dustin20 for 20% off.
So let's start by talking about the build and handling here. Viltrox has found a formula that I think that has worked overall for this series, although there is an important tweak that we'll get to in just a second that was desperately needed in terms of overall improvement. All of these lenses have been made out of engineered plastics is what the housing is made out of, based on a metal lens mount. But of course, there is varying degrees of engineered plastics. And whereas the Samyang Tiny series early on felt really plasticky and just kind of flimsy in terms of the build quality, these lenses have really consistently stood out to me as feeling actually quite robust. There's nothing really flimsy about them. The housing feels tough. There's no flex to anything. Overall, I think that although it's plastic, yes, it's good plastic, and it really does the job. And of course, the advantage here is it allows these lenses to be really, really lightweight. This lens is almost identical in size and weight to the 56mm f1.7. That's 64 millimeters in diameter, or 2.6 inches, and it is 54.7 millimeters or 2.15 inches in length. So obviously not quite pancake style, more like double pancake in terms of overall thickness. But of course, you're getting a faster maximum aperture than you would probably ever see in a pancake style lens. F1.7 is somewhat of an odd maximum aperture, not necessarily common, though obviously the 56mm was the same. You get a little bit of an advantage over an F1.8, the far more common maximum aperture, in that while F1.7 is 1/2 stop slower than F1.4, F1.8 is 2/3 stop slower than F1.4. So you get just a little bit more brightness in terms of the light gathering, a little bit more shallow depth of field. And so it's somewhere in between those two extremes, and obviously more towards the F1.8 side, but certainly gives you a little bit less of a disadvantage versus an F1.4 lens. Overall weight here is 170 grams or 6 ounces, meaning that this lens is super lightweight. It's going to be a really easy lens to bring along. You can throw it into your bag, and even if you don't happen to reach for it, you're probably not going to feel too bad about bringing it along because it is small and it is lightweight, which is a huge asset for this particular series. Up front, we have a 52mm front filter thread, which we have seen also on the 56mm lens. Nice if you're going to buy both of them to be able to share filters across them. Now, that significant improvement that I pointed to actually comes in the form of the lens hood. In the early, I think, 3 or 4 lenses that I have tested in that series, which included that 56mm, but also the full frame 20mm f2.8, and then also the 40mm f2.5. All of them had basically the same lens hood, and it was a very shallow lens hood that just didn't bayonet on with a lot of precision. I found that it was pretty easy to get it on there and then for it to move a little bit and just not quite line up the way that it should. It didn't really lock into position. We have a new lens hood here that is deeper, it feels more robust in terms of the build, but most importantly, it bayonets on with much more precision to where it kind of locks in there and you're not going to inadvertently bump it the way that you could with those previous lenses. It also comes with a lightweight lens pouch, not any kind of significant thing, but again, for the price tag, you're getting both a hood and a pouch, which is something you can't say for a lot of competing lenses. Now, as far as other features, there's not anything really going on here. There's no aperture ring, there are no buttons or switches on it. Inside, we do have 9 rounded aperture blades, which does help to have a pretty decent circular shape when you stop it down a bit. You also will get an 18-pointed sun star when the lens is stopped down. The one thing that we do have that has been a really consistent Viltrox feature is that there is a USB-C port on the lens mount. That's going to enable you to do easy firmware updates and is something that always is very welcome because I have seen some notable improvements through firmware updates, and also it's a means of making sure that your lens remains future-proof. If there's a firmware update or camera change in the future where the lens might not initially be compatible, that can be pretty easily fixed via firmware. And so far, Viltrox has shown that they will support their lenses via firmware update. This lens has the ability to focus down as closely as 33 centimeters and has a decent 0.13 times magnification. Now, the Fuji 35mm f2, it has very slightly more, 0.14 times, but this is at least in the ballpark. That hasn't always been a strength for Viltrox lenses, and so in this case, the fact that it's competitive is something I would say is positive. There is no weather sealing gasket at the lens mount. However, we do get an HD nano multi-layer coating on the front element, and that helps with some moisture on the front and also with cleaning for fingerprints and things like that. So overall, there's no bells and whistles here, but it's a nicely made lens. The manual focus ring feels and works good, and I did note that unlike some lenses on Fuji, you don't have to rotate again and again and again and again to make significant focus changes. It is not linear, so it is speed dependent, but at least if you want to move quickly, you actually have the ability to do so here. The price, as mentioned, is $179 US. That compares on the Fuji platform where I'm testing on, there's a Fuji 35mm f1.4 that retails for $599. There's also a 35mm f2, and that is going to retail for $399 US. And of course, if you want to go premium in the Viltrox space, not an identical focal length, but I continue to love the Pro 27mm f1.2, which is a really exceptional lens. Though it's more expensive, it's also much bigger and heavier. So if you want to travel light, I think this is a great option. Now, autofocus here comes via a lead screw type STM focus motor. And on Fuji, with these lenses, I've found a pretty big variance between the way that they focus on Fuji and then, for example, the way that they're going to focus on Sony. And that's not a credit to Fuji. I've become increasingly frustrated with Fuji as it feels like they are falling further and further behind when it comes to autofocus performance, but I've got to evaluate it within the constraints of what I'm reviewing it on, which is the Fujifilm X-H2. So autofocus here is quiet, that's a plus, but it's only averagely fast, and you will see some visible steps, though I suspect you won't see those from my experience on either Sony or Nikon from the other lenses that I've tested on those platforms. The real-world autofocus is fast enough that you probably won't think about it very much. When you're just making the normal kind of focus changes, those are fairly instantaneous. But if you have to make a really major change from close to minimum to infinity, you probably will see a little bit of a step along there. Autofocus has been accurate in my experience, and so I don't really have any complaints on that front. I was able to get the autofocus that I wanted in terms of accuracy in a variety of situations. I found that for some casual portraits, it locked onto the eye and tracked accurately for taking some shots of the pets. Again, I got accurate autofocus, well-focused results. As has been the case with these lenses on Fuji, I found that if there was persistent action, for example, in this burst of Ferrari kind of just coming up the trail behind me, that as he moves consistently, autofocus doesn't always quite keep up. And of course, that's not necessarily even fast action. If you're trying to track faster moving action with this lens, I think you're going to be disappointed because it does tend to back focus a little bit. It will just kind of fall behind. Unfortunately, that is all too common on the Fuji platform with kind of their non-premium, non-telephoto type lenses. So, you know, it's a bit of a mixed bag. For general purpose use, it's just fine. Autofocus is accurate, it's fast enough, and it's quiet, it gets the job done. On the video side of things, you know, it's the very familiar set of frustrations with video AF on Fuji, which is, you know, if I'm disappointed for stills, I'm far more disappointed when it comes to video. You can see the autofocus pulls here. They're just a lot of really obvious steps. And unfortunately, I only see steps like this these days on the Fuji platform. So frustrating to see this very obvious steps. And so it just feels, it's not a smooth cinematic feel at all in these focus pulls. You will see a little bit of focus breathing there as well. I went back and I took a look at my results on the same camera with the premium Fujifilm 35mm F1.4, which is their newest lens in this category. It's a lens I actually really like in a lot of ways. That's the LMWR. So it's got their linear motors. And I found that my focus pull test, it just really wasn't any better. It looked about identical to that kind of performance. It's kind of the state of play on the Fuji platform. It will be somewhat better on Sony, but of course on Sony you also have access to some better focusing lenses. And so as a byproduct of that, it will be still kind of mid-pack when it comes to the autofocus performance there. My hand test went reasonably well, but as you can see that there's a few instances where it actually focused past my head and had to rock back. And so that's obviously a little unfortunate because it adds an extra step in there that doesn't need to be as a part of the process. Out in real world shots, transitions were not bad. You know, sometimes you'll kind of hang on one subject, but it doesn't like just bounce right to the next subject. It's reasonably damp to where it doesn't feel kind of jarring in those transitions. So overall, not bad. My conclusion on autofocus, at least on Fuji, is that it's fine for portraits, events, general purpose shooting, but if you're wanting to keep up with young children or fast-moving pets or sports, probably not the best option out there, and unfortunately there aren't really a lot of great options at your disposal. But anyway, it's kind of par for the course here at this point. Much more positive is the image quality front. Now I'll give you a quick overview here and then my deep dive breakdown will come at the end of the video if you want that. We have an optical design of 11 elements in 9 groups. 4 of those are differing kinds of exotic elements, extra low dispersion elements, aspherical, and high refractive index elements that are part of that. You'll see looking here at the MTF that the thing that stands out to me is that the MTF is really actually surprisingly consistent all across the frame, which is very needed when you're talking about the most demanding sensor that I test on, which is Fujifilm's 40 megapixel APS-C sensor. It just has more pixels kind of packed in there than any other platform that I test. This is the equivalent of over 90 megapixels on a full frame camera. So it's just a lot to resolve. So having a really good looking MTF is important when it comes to a platform like this. As far as the breakdown, I found that there is very low distortion, somewhere between a -2 and a -3 to correct a bit of pincushion distortion. But there was a significantly heavy amount of vignette, about 3 stops, a +75 to correct for it. So you will obviously notice that. And so you'll need to correct that, although it is nicely linear in nature. So even leaving it uncorrected in shots doesn't look bad. It's going to be kind of shot dependent on whether or not you want to correct it. Fringing is not really an issue with this lens, either with the longitudinal style before and after the plane of focus, and then also the lateral style in the corners. There's very minimal amounts of each, and I didn't notice any kind of real-world issue with either one of them. I found in my test, again, that's shooting 40 megapixels. These results are shown at a 200% magnification. I found even at f1.7 that there was really consistent results across the frame. The center of the frame doesn't blow my mind in terms of overall detail, but the mid-frame looks about the same, and the corners are only just a little bit behind. So a nicely consistent performance there. I found when comparing back with the aforementioned Fujifilm 33mm F1.4, kind of the premium player in this class, I found that the Viltrox was a little bit less sharp in the center of the frame and about the same in the mid-frame and in the corners. That was with the Fuji lens at f1.8 versus f1.7 here. I found when stopping the lens down, the Viltrox down, you did get steadily improving contrast and detail. By the time you get to the landscape apertures of f5.6 and f8, it's nicely consistent across the frame, and I was perfectly happy with the amount of detail, contrast, and overall look that I could get. On a very high resolution body like this, you will run into diffraction. By f11, the image is softening, and by f16, it is noticeably soft by comparison. I found that color rendition overall is quite nice, and that is an area where Viltrox has made huge strides since their early days. I didn't love their optical glass early on, but over the last couple of years, I've been consistently impressed with the overall accuracy and color rendition. Very, very nice, particularly in such an inexpensive lens. And I think that may be one area where it can differentiate itself from other inexpensive options out there, is that the optical glass, overall color rendition and look of images is a little bit better. Now, the bokeh quality is good, but not great, in my opinion. I found that obviously that the $800 33mm lens from Fuji, that's a real strength for it. It actually renders really, really nicely. This isn't quite at that level, but overall, I also didn't find anything objectionable about the bokeh. In a variety of situations, I could get fairly soft backgrounds, fairly creamy, and overall, I would say even specular highlights look pretty good. And you can see from the shot in the sauna, that even if you stop down in this shot, it's f2.5. Even by stopping down a little bit, you can see you're getting pretty nicely circular specular highlights right off into the corners. So I do appreciate that as well. Flare resistance is mostly good. It seems to be most flare prone if the sun is just kind of right out of frame. You get a little bit of flashing and a little bit of veiling or a loss of contrast. Shooting right into it, not too bad. Stopping down, you're going to see a little bit more ghosting artifacts. But in general, not bad. I would say the flare resistance is decent, but not exceptional. I did find good results from shooting the night sky and testing for coma, however, and I found that, again, because there's very little fringing, that star points aren't marred by kind of like any purple around them, but also there's not really much in terms of coma distortion in the corners of the frame, so again, for a budget, this is a pretty nice little astro lens, all things considered. So here's my conclusion. I think that the Air series is really hitting a sweet spot for a lot of buyers. And when they mentioned a lens in this focal length, I was excited to test it because I do think that this is a lens that it makes for a great first prime for a lot of people, maybe to augment maybe their kit lens or something like that. And if you're coming from a lens like a kit lens, you're going to be really, really blown away by how sharp this lens is and by how much subject separation you can actually get. This is essentially a Nifty 50, but this is a really good Nifty 50 at a very, very strong price. I would call this a very competent, very lightweight lens that at such a low price point has a great price to performance ratio. It's a lens I think is going to be incredibly useful for a lot of people. So I consider this to be a very solid option, whether you're shooting on Fuji, as I've tested, Sony or Nikon APS-C. Now, if you want more information, you can check out my full text review that is linked in the description down below. There are buying links there. Link is to an image gallery if you want to see more photos. And if you want a deeper dive into that optical performance, stay tuned with me right now. Let's dive into it together.
Okay, so we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. So you can see in the distortion department here on the left in the uncorrected raw image, we have just the tiniest bit of pincushion distortion. No big deal. You can see on the right, I could correct that no problem by dialing in a -3. Vignette, however, is another story. Vignette is quite heavy, and you can see that it corrects fine, but I did use a +75 to correct for it. And so that is a significant amount, about 3 stops. Now, the nature of the vignette is that it's fairly linear. So in this case, I've removed any kind of correction, and so the corners are darker, but because it kind of moves gradually towards the center, you can see that the image here doesn't really look all that bad, even at f1.7. And of course, as we're going to see, you can also see a really nice amount of sharpness here at f1.7 as well. Now, when it comes to fringing, we can see a nice result here. When it comes to longitudinal style chromatic aberrations, you can see a little bit of magenta fringing before, a tiny bit of green afterward, but overall it's really quite neutral. And so if I go out into a real world shot, very high contrast here, you can see that contrast is holding up really nicely on the plane of focus. And then you can see there's a little bit of blooming as we move out of focus, but not really a lot in terms of fringing. So pretty neutral in that regard. Another shot here where there's lots of bright light coming through here, and you can see overall that there really isn't much to see in terms of fringing. Really great job in that regard. Now, when it comes to lateral style chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame, I do see just a tiny bit in this uncorrected f8 image from my test chart. You can see just a little bit of fringing on either side. It's obviously not very pronounced. You may not see it if I didn't point it out. So if I jump into a real world style shot here, where I do have some branches that are starting to get bare up here, I can see looking up into this area that I don't see any kind of real cause for concern. I don't really see much in terms of fringing. And again, I have removed any kind of correction from this image, so it actually holds up quite well. Now, as far as overall resolution here looking at 200% magnification, we can see in the center of the frame that contrast and detail looks good. Not off the charts good, but part of that is just the fact that Fuji files remain the most difficult to sharpen. And so overall, however, it looks good relative to other Fuji lenses. We can also see here as we move to the mid-frame, I don't really see any kind of drop-off. We're seeing still very good contrast, very good detail, a pretty consistent performance from the left side of this build to the lower right side. And then we can see even as we move off into the corners that really that's a pretty great looking end result. And if for context I put the $800 33mm f1.4 Fuji lens here, we can see that in the center of the frame, I do prefer the Fuji lens. I feel like it has more contrast. It's resolving the fine details with a little more contrast. So, I think it's taking a win in that regard. In the mid frame, however, as we move here, and I've moved away, just so you know, I've moved away from the newer bills like this because when I try to recreate these things in Photoshop, a lot of times it just won't allow me to do it. So I'm using older style bills now that are just not in circulation, so I don't have that issue. So we can't do necessarily a head-to-head comparison there, but if we look at this zone here, I would say that the mid-frame results are about the same, and maybe the Viltrox has a little bit better contrast. As we come on down here, we can see again that the results, color balance is not the same, but in terms of the contrast and the detail, they really are pretty much the same, and I think that the Viltrox is every bit as good, if not a hair better. And as we move down into the very edge performance here, we can see that again, once again, detail and contrast, very, very consistent across these two. So for being about a quarter of the cost, I would say that the Viltrox holds up really quite well. Taking a look at a real-world image at f5 or 1.7, I should say, you can see here that there's plenty of detail and contrast there, able to resolve all those little fine hairs, and the focus is right on the eye as it should be. So good result there. Here's another f1.7 result, and again, depth of field is going to be fairly narrow here, but you can see in these edges, there's no blooming at the edges. They're nice and crisp, good detail, good contrast that's there. So overall, a really nice performance, even wide open. Now, stopping down to f2, first of all, you see that there is a significant metering difference, which is always good to see. We can also see that I would say that the contrast is a little more intense. I don't see a lot of additional detail there, but I do see an uptick in contrast. If we move on from f2 to f2.8, it's kind of the same pattern where you can see that the darks are darkening, becoming a little bit more intense. And we can see that even when it comes to the writing here on the bill, you can see that the inkiness is just deeper on that. It's not a radical difference, but certainly an improvement overall. Now, if we pop in one more time into the performance of the 33mm, now both of them at f2.8, pretty obvious win for the 33mm in the center of the frame. It's definitely doing a great job there. And down into the corner, I would say that it's also kind of coming out as a winner here. And we can see in the other places where we look that, it's not, again, the difference is not really significant in this portion of the image, but there certainly is a win for the more expensive 33mm. You'll see further improvements by f4 and then by f5.6. And that contrast and detail will hold up through f8, but then as you get to f11, it's going to soften a little bit due to diffraction. But by f16, which is minimum aperture, you can see that the image is really obviously softened due to the effects of diffraction. We jump to a real-world landscape shot just to kind of give you a look at the detail. You can see that here there's lots of fine detail all throughout this scene. It's a big scene with a lot going on in terms of the textures. But you can see right off here into the corners that there's still a nice amount of detail overall. And so really a nice job, a good performance out in real-world sharpness. As mentioned previously, I feel like colors are really nicely executed with the lens, giving images overall a nice look. Up-close performance here is really quite good overall. I can see that the detail and contrast have held up, really nicely at this close focus distance, so that obviously improves the usefulness of the lens up close. In this shot here, we can see both the sharpness in the plane of focus. You can see in this area here, nice and crisp at f1.7. Then it also gives you a chance to evaluate the out of focus area. I think that some of these textures, there's a little more outlining that makes it not quite as creamy as it could be, but overall the image looks pretty good. This image here, which has a little bit more favorable ratio, I think as we move, just the defocus on the background is more, just more pronounced. You can see that maybe there's a little bit of outlining in this zone, but as you get further out, it's really nice and soft and creamy. So certainly can produce great looking images with this lens. Of course, contrast and detail up close here really looks great. Here's kind of the yin and yang of the previous image, and you could see same kind of thing to where, yeah, there's a little bit of a hard edge here I don't love. This zone, maybe very slightly jittery, but it does become creamy as it moves towards further defocus. This shot here, number one, again, it shows good contrast and detail on the side of the bucket here. And then at f2.5, we can see that really it's not squeezing too much. Nice circular shapes all across this area and the specular highlights. Now, I mentioned that the lens stood out as doing a good job when it comes to coma. And you can see here, as we linger here for a moment, you can see that there's no fringing that's affecting star points, and so that they look really nice and crisp. And even as we move right off here into the corners, I see very, very little in terms of coma. Star points are really remaining pretty similar to what they are closer to the middle of the frame. So a nice performance in that regard. Finally, when it comes to flare resistance, here we can see where I've kind of eliminated any kind of potential flare artifacts just by the composition, but I have allowed you to get a little bit better look at the sunburst effect, which looks pretty nice here. Here's another shot here at kind of a medium aperture, but again, because I've used a little hole in the leaf to eliminate any kind of flare artifacts. In this shot, however, you can see a bit of veiling that's taking place due to the sun being just kind of out of frame, and that's where you're going to see flare artifacts most strongly.
So hopefully the deep dive into the optical performance has helped to answer any lingering questions you might have had as to whether or not this is the lens for you. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.